Thank you for tuning into Literary Blend, a publishing podcast. I'm your host, Demi Michelle Schwartz. There's no perfect recipe for chasing a dream in the publishing industry, but I hope the conversations on this show give you the ingredients you need to bake yours into reality. So let's flip the page and get into this chapter of Literary Blend. Hi friends, welcome back to Literary Blend. Today's chapter is called Getting Books on Library Shelves. And joining me on the show to chat about this topic is Karen McCoy. Hi, Karen.
Hi,
How are you?
I'm doing okay.
Awesome.
I'm really honored to be on this podcast.
Yeah, no, it's a delight having you. I'm super excited to pick your brain about libraries and more. But before we get into our conversation, I would love for you to share with the listeners a little about yourself and your journey in publishing.
Absolutely. So my name is Karen McCoy. I've wanted to write ever since I was young. And I always knew I wanted to do something revolving around books. And so I ended up coming to librarianship as part of that path. Randomly, my 7th grade history teacher was on a bus to the airport with me when I was in my 20s at another career that I was failing at. And I asked her, "Oh, librarian, how do you do that?" And she said, "Library degree." So I ended up getting my master's in information studies from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. But I'd always wanted to write a novel, and that was always in the back of my brain. So during my first librarian job at a public library, I was at a city meeting, and this was now in New Mexico, where I ended up having my first job. And I was in this all day training, this HR training where you read the employee handbook for 8 hours. And I had this moment of, wow, is this all there is? There's this exit room at the back of, the brightest thing in the room is the exit sign. And I ended up turning over a notebook and writing what became my first novel. And that was about 16 years ago. I've drafted around 10 drafts or sorry, 10 manuscripts. And I've edited maybe 3 or 4, queried some, and last year I got my acceptance for my upcoming novel, my middle grade mystery, The Etiquette of Voles, which is due out on June 10th of this year.
So exciting. Congratulations on having a book coming out and also with your librarian journey as well.
Yes. I was very lucky in that journey because I was also a book selector for a time, and I got to know the decisions that librarians and libraries make when they are purchasing material, and that was helped me inform my own publishing journey. As an example, so I selected books from in a 28 library system, and I selected from ages 0 to 18 for that whole system for a time. And what I learned in that process is that there's no such thing as too many picture books. And so my budget for picture books was always through the roof. But I had less of a budget for middle grade titles and for young adult titles. And so the criteria became uh, we used a vendor, Baker and Taylor, and they would show reviews from publications like Library Journal and Booklist and Kirkus and all of those things. And basically, our criteria was if it got a star review in School Library Journal or if it got a star review in Booklist, I had to purchase it for the collection. And for a 28 library system, that meant one copy for the main collection and then 4 what we called floating copies, which would go around to the different libraries in the system. So usually a total of 5, unless it was a huge big anticipated bestseller and there were a lot of holds on it. Usually the criteria was 10 holds per one copy purchase. So if you had, for example, 30 holds, you would have to get 3 extra copies of a book.
So much great insight to kick off this conversation, it's really interesting because when you think about wanting to pitch books to libraries, especially for like self-published authors or published through a small press. Um, do you see those being as more challenging to get on the shelves than traditionally published books with a big five publisher?
Absolutely. What's good about some reviewers, I think Kirkus does include small publishers, maybe indie publishers. I would have to research that. Again, that's my librarian kicking in. I want to make sure that I have good information. I'm not 100% sure that Kirkus does indie books that are self-published, but that'd be worth looking into as far as which retail place, sorry, retail, which review places review self-published books. Because getting a lot of positive reviews and buzz is always helpful. Um, I'll speak to indie small publishers first, and then I'll speak to self-publishing after. So small publishers, it helps if they have good distribution. I am also published through a small publisher, Artemisia Publishing with Kinkajou Press, which is the middle grade imprint as a part of that publisher. And they have distribution through a group called Independent Publishers Group, which means that my book will be available on retailers that libraries purchase from, such as Baker and Taylor, such as there's another one called Goby, and the really big one, which also bookstores publish, bookstores purchase from, is something called Ingram. And so as long as your book is available on Ingram, and Ingram for self-published authors has something called Ingram Spark. So that can sometimes be helpful as long as books are available through those retailers. Um, it helps as far as getting it on a library shelf. Now, as far as self-published authors go, I'm going to say what not to do first, and then I'll say kind of my recommendation for self-published authors. What not to do is to approach the library desk in person and say, please shelve my book. That's always awkward for everyone involved. And I wouldn't want self published authors to even put themselves in that kind of a situation to begin with. Instead, what I've recommended to people is if you can get someone else in your community to recommend that the library purchase that book on the shelf. Um, I did this for it was an author that I know, Catherine Arguelles. She writes really great middle grade books. One is called Flip Turns that you should absolutely check out. But then she has a self-published, or not self-published, but a more kind of independently published book called First to Find. That's also very good. And because the library our local library, and she's a local author, they already had Flip Terms on the shelf. I said, oh, here's this other book from this author that I would hope that the library would purchase. And what's really helpful with patron requests is that librarians, especially ones who purchase books, one of their main goals is to meet the needs of the user, specifically the users in their library community. And if users are asking for a particular title, then the librarian says, okay, this is what our users want. And so therefore I can publish it for the collection.
I love that. So when it comes down to approaching the librarian and asking as someone, not the author, but like you said, a request, do those happen? Like, I'm sure libraries are different, but do you like call and talk to someone, or is there like a form on the website? What's typically how that works?
Usually there's a form on the website anymore. That's what a lot of library systems have. Now, I should point out that there's no guarantee that a librarian will purchase a title if it's requested that way, but that definitely there's a much higher chance of that. Um, and it's also good to think about different ways you can collaborate with your librarian. Say, a lot of librarians, especially public librarians, the other main goal is to get people in the doors. And if you're willing to collaborate with the librarians on some kind of event or something, that can also offer a way for librarians to get acquainted with you, your brand, and your book.
I love that. That was actually one of the questions I was going to bring up with author events and their correlation to getting your books on the shelf. So in that instance, would you recommend reaching out? So say you have a local author and they have a book coming out, whether through chat or indie self publishing, whatever, and they're hoping to get their book on the shelf. Would you recommend that author reaching out to do some kind of event prior to asking if the library would shelve the book?
Here's what I would recommend, and this is how I've seen it done in larger cities. I can't speak to rural places, but I can at least speak to large cities. What I've seen done is that often cities will have what they call a local author showcase, and then so authors can talk to each other and then coordinate with librarians as far as having a large event with a bunch of local authors. You can some libraries, not all, they also have a local author shelf where they are able to put these kinds of titles as well. So you can always inquire about that, especially on the more rural level. The thing about author events is some libraries, again, it just depends on their communities and their demographics and the people they are serving. It helps to know if they have a large draw when it comes to author events. Not all libraries do, and so these are just conversations that you can have with your local librarians and kind of frame instead of framing it as a, hey, I want you to put my book on the shelf. It's more, how can I help you meet the needs of the community, and how can I, as a local author, assist with that?
Perfect. I love that. And I think that goes for any kind of interaction in like the PR space. And I'm a musician as well. I'm a songwriter, so I do a lot of that myself. And there have been so many times where like I've reached out to like a radio station or something, not asking them, hey, can you play my song, or hey, can you interview me, but like doing something to give a benefit to them and to help them in some way, and then they would just turn around and like offer me something like I didn't even have to ask for it. And so I think that's where people can really stand out in like any kind of interaction like this, because I'm sure librarians have constant emails and calls from authors wanting their books on the shelf. But if you approach the interaction with, what can I do for you and your community, then you will definitely stand out from all the other authors who just want something in it for them and don't approach it as, I want to help the community in the library.
Right. And I think there's a twofold. One of the things that happens, especially with the dawn of AI and things like this, is what some promotional places will advertise as, oh, we're going to do a mass email for libraries, and that isn't really the best approach because it feels very unpersonalized. I remember, so I'm actually currently working in an academic library where the collection um, objectives are a lot kind of slightly different for an academic, because usually in academic libraries and school libraries they're wanting to select more toward the curriculum. I wrote an article for Library Journal back in 2011 talking about the differences between how school libraries select their material and how public libraries select their material, and I surveyed librarians from both institutions, and I found that school librarians were more likely at that time in 2011, again, things might have changed since then, that school librarians were more likely to purchase kind of realistic fiction and things that were linked to the curriculum, like nonfiction material. Whereas the public libraries, again, we're just trying to get people in the door. We want people to have kind of a pleasurable reading experience. I mean, not that school reading isn't pleasurable, but Um, and so the selections for public libraries tended to be more on the fantasy kind of science fiction. And actually, a note about that really fast. A lot of it also has to do with how the books are cataloged in the collection as far as findability. This In one of my library systems I worked in, I didn't know this cataloger, but I was told about this cataloger who had retired by the time that I had started working. And this retired cataloger had insisted that anything supernatural, whether it was aliens, whether it was fantasy, all had to have a science fiction sticker on it. And that's not necessarily helpful for fantasy authors because that is a completely different readership than science fiction. So when I was in that library, I would literally find Game of Thrones books with alien stickers on them. And that's not great for a lot of reasons. But but the whole thing is how they organize their collection. Usually fiction is by last name, and sometimes genre stickers kind of can affect um, how readers find books too. So basically, so now I'm an academic librarian, and our instead of being so since we are a school library, technically at the college level, our job is to get stuff for the curriculum rather than the most popular stuff. We still get award winners, I would say, like we still get the Newberries and the Pella Dupreys and the Coretta Scott Kings and such. But the main objective of so basically what I'm saying is libraries have different goals, especially if it's an academic library versus a public library. So, for example, I remember getting one of these blanket emails at one of the academic institutions that I worked at. And of course, it was somebody's self published. I don't know if it was fantasy or science fiction, it was one of those. And of course, that's not really, as far as academic library goals, that's not really something they would necessarily put on the shelf in that way. And of course, and you can tell when it's like a canned
Oh, yeah.
email.
Uh-huh.
Um, and so
Yeah. As somebody who hosts 2 podcasts, I can tell because they don't address it, hi to me. Uh, oh my goodness. Yeah, so much great information. I think this ties into researching as well, making sure the library you are pitching has the ability or is the right fit for your book. So another question I have for you is when it comes to evaluating like children's books, like picture books, middle grade YA, what goes into that? Because the libraries would obviously want to make sure that the books they're putting on the shelves is like safe and appropriate. So, what's that process like?
I'm really glad that you brought up safe and appropriate. And I think this is actually a really important point, and one reason why authors should support libraries anyway, regardless of whether you want your book on the shelf or not, is what libraries do is they allow free access to information for people who might not always be able to afford that monetarily. And so one of the best things we can do, especially when it comes to children's books and evaluating kind of appropriateness, and I may go into kind of this whole book banning phenomenon we're seeing, especially, I mean, it's been going on for hundreds of years, but especially in the last 5 to 10 to 15 years, it has really ramped up. And a lot of school librarians and youth and teen public librarians are having to field these kinds of questions about books that are appropriate for children. Um, so here's what I will say to that. One author, I think it was Catherine Applegate. Yeah, it was Catherine Applegate who basically posed a really good question about. She asked, "What about the child that needs that book?" So when I think about children's books, I want to make sure that children can see themselves in books because that is so important. So that's one of the criteria I use. Is it a point of view that's not usually seen? The other thing as far as picture books versus middle grade versus young adult, for picture books, anything that's really great for story time is always key. And what I mean by that is librarians do a lot of story time, and it's usually anything that's really interactive that kids can participate in during the story time itself. It has to do with less text per image ratio. I have seen independently published picture books that are really text heavy, and I would just talk to basically, I would urge those picture book authors to say, how can you marry the text and your illustration in a way that is the most engaging? Basically, when it comes to kind of child-friendly appropriateness of books, what parents can do is they can look at the books themselves first and then determine if it's something they feel comfortable with their child reading. But yeah, so that's kind of for picture books. And I should also talk about the difference between picture books and easy readers because picture books are designed for parents to read to their children, and easy readers are for like the very first books that children try to read themselves. Um, so those can come in different levels. And so that's something I also had to think about when ordering is I want to have enough easy readers, and easy readers also include nonfiction books as well as fiction books. Okay, so basically chapter books are transition from picture books into middle grade, and middle grade is usually 8 to 12. And so those are books like The One and Only Ivan. Usually your Newbery Medal winners are going to be in that middle grade category. And then young adult has usually starts around 13 and up, 14 and up, sometimes 15 and up, and sometimes it'll just depend on what kind of review they got, whether it was Booklist or Library Journal or Kirkus. And then it would think about, okay, what community am I serving? What demographic of people are in my community? And would they appreciate this book or not? So that's usually kind of the gaps between the different age groups that librarians usually think about. It's tough to have a protagonist who's 14, and I know that publishing struggles with that age group as well because it's kind of this middle area. And the other thing I want to say about middle grade really quickly is that it has chapter books are considered middle grade, and large books like Harry Potter are also considered middle grade, at least the first two in the series. And so with middle grade, you kind of have this wide range of reading level that happens in a way that doesn't really. So YA can also kind of go into adult, but usually YA is kind of solidly YA, and picture books are solidly picture books, and then middle grade kind of has this really wide range in the middle.
Perfect. So much great information. Thank you for sharing. So, my last question for you is just as a wrap up, what are final thoughts you would love to share about getting books on library shelves?
Libraries need your support now more than ever, just even as a member of the community. So, just thinking about how my book meets that community need in a library. Are there people that I can ask to request that the library purchase that book? And usually that's through an online request form. And usually online request forms work for books even if they're only available through Amazon and nowhere else, for example. Basically, it's thinking about not just how your book will sell, but who will actually read your book and who your audience is. And is that audience a part of your library community?
Perfect. Well, Karen, this has been such a delay, and this brings us to the plot twist where I get to ask you a fun question you could have never seen coming.
Cool.
Ready?
Totally ready.
Awesome. So, speaking of libraries, your question is what is one of your favorite childhood library memories?
One of my favorite childhood, I have two of them. So, my two libraries when I was a child, I grew up in the Napa Valley in a tiny little town called St. Helena, which has a population of 6,000 people. And so the public library, they had this really great area where I could just pick off a book off the shelf and read. They had all these bean bags. It was a really comfortable and safe space. In fact, I ran into that the librarian. Her name was Leslie Stanton, and I ran into her at an American Library Association conference one time. Me as a librarian, and so we got to talk about library stuff, and it was super great. The other library I had was with the media center at St. Helena Elementary School, and Susan Calkin was our librarian. And I don't know if you're familiar with an author named Dennis Kazette, but he was local. And what he would do is he would bring in uh, drafts of his picture books. And as far as publishing goes, these picture books are often drafted on these things called dummies. And he would bring in his dummies to show us so that I was able to put together in my brain, oh, anybody can write a book. It's just a matter of where the book gets made. It doesn't just magically appear on the shelf. There's actually a process to this. And so that was also a really good memory for me as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me. Can you please share with everybody where they can connect with you online and check out your book when it comes out later this year?
Absolutely. So my website is Karen B, that's B as in boy, McCoy.com. That is my middle initial. That's also the name that I will be writing with, Karen B. McCoy. And so that's my website. On Instagram and Threads, you can find me at Karen McCoy Books. And luckily, I'm also on Blue Sky, which is a recent thing for me. And Blue Sky also matches my website, Karen B. McCoy at bsky.social. And my book will be available through bookshop.org, Barnes and Noble, Amazon. I have a Goodreads page. So basically, if you go to karenbmccoy.com/book, you can get all the information about my book. My book is called The Etiquette of Voles, Voles. My protagonist is a talking vole. He came to me very fully fleshed one day and demanded to be written down. He said, "I'm a vole," and I said, "No one knows what that is." And he said, "Write me down anyway." So it's called The Etiquette of Voles, and the basic premise of it is this talking vole solves mysteries in Queen Victoria's London to figure out the origin of himself and why he can speak.
Oh, so fun. Oh, so good.
Yeah,
So excited for
he's a
you.
lot of fun. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me for this chat.
Absolutely, thank you. This was a wonderful experience, and I want to say thanks. You asked really good questions.
Awesome, absolutely. And listeners, that is a wrap on my chat with Karen all about getting books on library shelves. If you enjoyed our conversation, please consider leaving Literary Blind a review and giving it 5 stars to help others just like you discover it. Also, if you have friends in publishing you think would enjoy the show, please pass it along to them. Thanks for listening, and until we flip to the next chapter, happy reading and writing.